The flight line at Ellsworth Air Force Base lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness. The only sounds breaking the silence were the distant hum of generators and the anxious footsteps of ground crews preparing for a mission that could change everything. Captain Sarah Chen stood beneath the massive swept wings of her B-1 Lancer, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid South Dakota air at 4:32 a.m., her gloved hand resting against the cold metal of the bomber that had become more than just a machine to her over the past 6 years. The alert had come through 90 minutes earlier, scrambling her crew for an emergency deployment to the Middle East, and the weight of that urgency pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She could see her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, completing his pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, his usually cheerful face set in grim determination. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from beneath the aircraft, giving her a thumbs up that the weapon systems were green, though his eyes betrayed the same nervous energy that buzzed through everyone on the tarmac that morning. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Captain, we've got clearance for immediate departure, Webb called out, climbing up the ladder into the cockpit. Command says there's a narrow weather window, and if we don't take it now, we're delayed 6 hours minimum. Sarah felt her heart rate kick up a notch as she processed this information, knowing that 6 hours could mean the difference between success and catastrophe for the ground forces waiting for their support halfway across the world. She hauled herself up into the pilot's seat, the familiar embrace of the cockpit both comforting and terrifying in that moment, surrounded by countless switches, displays, and indicators that represented the culmination of decades of American air power engineering. Behind her in the weapons systems officer station, Captain James Park was already running through his checklists, his fingers dancing across the touchscreens with practiced ease despite the pressure they were all feeling. Tower, this is Boeing 7-2, requesting immediate taxi and departure, Sarah transmitted, using the B-1's call sign as she fired up the 4 massive engines. The rumble that shook through the airframe was like waking a sleeping giant. 23,000 pounds of thrust per engine coming online, and filling the night with sound that made conversation impossible without headsets. Boeing 7-2, you are cleared to taxi runway 21, came the response, and Sarah felt the massive bomb begin to roll forward, its 190,000 pounds of fuel, weapons, and hope moving toward the active runway. The tower controller's voice came back through her headset, more serious now, stripped of the usual casual radio banner. Be advised, you'll be executing a maximum performance takeoff due to payload and distance requirements, Captain. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls because she knew exactly what that meant. They would be pushing this aircraft and themselves to the absolute edge of the envelope, climbing at angles that would make passengers on a commercial flight scream in terror, pulling G-forces that would press them back into their seats until breathing became difficult. Copy that, Tower, she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. Webb, you ready for this? She glanced at her co-pilot, seeing her own nervous excitement reflected in his face. Born ready, Captain, he responded with a tight smile. Though I might have packed a lighter breakfast if I'd known we were going to pull this kind of maneuver. The runway stretched out before them like a ribbon of lights pointing toward an invisible horizon, and Sarah brought the bomb to the hold line, running through final checks while her heart hammered against her ribs. Boeing 7-2, winds 230 at 15, clear for takeoff, max performance authorized, the tower transmitted, and Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration was immediate and overwhelming, all 4 engines spooling up to full military power, then beyond into afterburner, the roar becoming something primal and unstoppable as 70 feet of swept-wing bomber hurtled down the runway. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly, 100 knots, 120, 140, and Sarah could feel every rivet and panel of the aircraft straining against the forces being applied to it. Rotate. Webb called out precisely the right moment, and Sarah pulled back on the stick, lifting the nose of the B-1 into an angle that seemed impossibly steep. The positive G-forces slammed into her body, making her vision narrow slightly at the edges as blood tried to rush away from her brain, but she held the climb angle steady, trusting the aircraft and her training even as the altimeter spun upward with dizzying speed. Gear up, she commanded, and the landing gear retracted with solid thumps that she felt through the airframe. They punched through a low cloud deck at 5,000 feet, emerging into a star-filled sky that seemed close enough to touch and still she maintained the aggressive climb, the ground falling away below them at a rate of 6,000 feet per minute. 10,000 feet, Webb announced, his voice tight with the strain of breathing against the G-forces. 15,000. Sarah knew that maintenance crews and base personnel on the ground would be watching this departure, seeing the brilliant points of light from their afterburners climbing into the night sky at an angle that defied logic. "Command, this is Bone 7-2. Successful departure, proceeding to waypoint Alpha," she transmitted once they reached cruising altitude, finally able to ease back on the controls and let the massive bomber settle into a more comfortable flight profile. The tension in the cockpit remained thick despite the successful takeoff, because they all knew this was just the beginning of a mission that would test every skill they possessed. "Captain," Park's voice came from behind her, carrying a note of concern. "I'm showing some unusual readings on the number 3 engine." Sarah's stomach dropped because an engine problem at this stage of the mission, loaded with fuel and weapons, heading toward a combat zone, was the kind of scenario that turned into nightmare fuel for pilots. "Define unusual," she said, keeping her voice level while her mind raced through emergency procedures. "Temperature fluctuations, nothing critical yet, but it's not behaving normally," Park responded. Webb was already pulling up the engine diagnostics on his display, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Could be a sensor issue," he offered, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe that explanation. Sarah made a decision that she knew would be questioned but felt right in her gut. "We continue to the tanker rendezvous," she announced. "We'll monitor the engine closely, but those troops on the ground need us, and I'm not turning back unless we have a confirmed emergency." She could feel the weight of command in that moment, knowing that 3 other lives besides her own depended on her judgment, knowing that soldiers she'd never met were counting on the weapons in her bomb bay to keep them alive through whatever hell they were facing. "Rodriguez, keep a close eye on those engine parameters," she added. "Any change, I want to know immediately." The hours that followed became a test of endurance and nerve as they flew eastward, meeting the aerial refueling tanker over the Atlantic at 28,000 feet, the delicate operation of connecting the refueling boom while watching that temperamental engine, adding an extra layer of stress to an already demanding procedure. Sarah watched the fuel quantity indicators climb while trying not to think about the dozen things that could go wrong when you're pumping thousands of pounds of volatile jet fuel through a flying boom at 500 miles per hour. "Disconnect complete," the boom operator finally called, and Sarah eased a B, one away from the tanker, breathing a sigh of relief that they'd made it through that phase without incident. Dawn broke over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Sarah hadn't been so focused on the mission clock counting down and that stubborn engine warning that wouldn't clear. "Approaching the eastern Mediterranean," Webb announced. "Command is requesting our status." Sarah keyed the radio, knowing that her next words would commit them fully to whatever waited ahead. "Command, Bone 7-2, all systems operational. Ready to proceed to target area," she transmitted, making a conscious choice to classify the engine issue as manageable rather than mission critical. The response came back immediately. Coordinates for a danger-close air support mission where enemy forces had surrounded a small American outpost, and the only thing keeping those soldiers alive was a promise of air support that was now solely dependent on Sarah and her crew. "They're really counting on us," Park said quietly from a station, and Sarah felt the full weight of that truth settle over the cockpit. She brought the B-1 into its attack profile, descending toward the target coordinates, while her weapons officer armed the precision-guided munitions in the bomb bay. The radio crackled with the voice of the ground controller, a young soldier whose stress was audible even through the static. "Bone 7-2, this is Ground Team Alpha. We are taking heavy fire from grid coordinates I'm sending now. Danger close. Repeat, danger close to friendly positions." Sarah's hands flew across the controls, bringing the massive bomber into its attack run while her mind calculated angles, distances, and a razor-thin margin for error when dropping weapons near American troops. "Weapons hot," Park announced, and Sarah felt the aircraft shudder as the bomb bay doors opened, altering the aerodynamics and creating buffeting that she had to compensate for with subtle control inputs. "Target locked. Ready for release on your mark, Captain." Sarah's world narrowed to display showing the target coordinates and the electronic symbology that would guide their weapons to within meters of the designated impact point. 3, 2, 1, release. She counted down and felt the distinct sensation of the aircraft rising slightly as 2,000 pounds of ordnance separated from a bomb bay. Bombs away, Park confirmed, and Sarah pulled the B-1 into a hard climbing turn, getting them away from the target area while her heart pounded in her ears. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours before the ground controller's voice came back to the radio, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for confirmation of either success or the kind of tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Bone 7-2, Ground Team Alpha. Good hits, enemy positions destroyed. You just saved our lives up here. The relief that flooded to the cockpit was almost physical, and Sarah saw Webb wipe at his eyes quickly, the emotional release of that moment overwhelming after hours of sustained tension. They turned west, back toward the tanker track, and eventually home, the engine warning finally clearing somewhere over the Mediterranean as mysteriously as it had appeared, as if the aircraft itself had understood the stakes and held together through sheer willpower. Days later, standing on the same flight line where this had all begun, Sarah watched another crew prepare their B-1 for launch, and she thought about courage and fear and the impossibly thin line between disaster and triumph that she walked every time she climbed into that cockpit. The sunrise was painting the sky in those same shades of orange and gold, and somewhere across the world, soldiers she would never meet were alive because she and her crew had pushed through their fear, trusted their training, and delivered when it mattered most, which was, she reflected, what the terrifying business of military aviation had always been about: